The barbed wire fence sagged in the July heat, rusted and forgotten like the war itself. Sheriff Tom Brennan stood at the edge of the old POW camp, now nothing but concrete foundations and mesquite trees, holding a faded photograph that would unravel 30 years of silence. The woman in the picture wore Wehrmacht gray. The woman on the Hansen ranch wore denim and dust. They were the same person. It was 1973, and America was trying to forget about wars. Vietnam haunted the television screens every night, but this was about a different war, a different enemy, a different time. Tom had been 23 years old when the German prisoners arrived in Texas, young and eager in his deputy uniform, watching the trucks roll through town with their cargo of defeated soldiers. Now he was 53, with gray in his hair and a cold case file that refused to stay buried. One prisoner had vanished during a cotton-picking detail in August 1943. The Army searched for 3 weeks, dragged the creeks, questioned every farmer within 50 miles. Then they stamped the file closed. Probably died in the hills, they said. Coyotes and heat, that's all. But Tom had never believed it. He'd spent 3 decades watching, waiting, a splinter in his mind that wouldn't work free. The call came from a lawyer's office in Austin. Estate settlement, routine background check, something about a birth certificate that didn't match up. The lawyer was apologetic, probably nothing, but wasn't there an old case about a missing German prisoner? The name was different now. Lena Hansen, not Lena Hoffman. But the birth date matched, the birthplace matched, and when Tom drove out to the Hansen ranch with that photograph, when he saw her standing on the porch with her hands on her hips and the sun behind her, he knew. She knew that he knew. For a long moment they just stared at each other across 30 years of silence. Then she said in English with just the faintest trace of an accent, "I suppose you'd better come inside, Sheriff. I'll put on some coffee." The Hansen ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of hill country, limestone bluffs and live oak groves and pastures where Hereford cattle grazed in the long grass. Lena had built it from nothing, people said, worked like a man, never complained, never asked for help she couldn't repay. She'd arrived in 1945, or so the story went, a war widow from Colorado looking for a fresh start, bought a hardscrabble piece of land with money nobody questioned, lived in a tent that first summer, dug her own well. The locals respected that kind of grit. Texas had always welcomed people running from something, as long as they worked hard and kept their business to themselves. By 1950, she had a house. By 1960, she had the biggest cattle operation in the county. By 1973, she was Lena Hansen, rancher, neighbor, the woman who brought casseroles to funerals and never missed a vote. Nobody had ever thought to ask about the years before 1945. Nobody except Tom Brennan. Inside the ranch house, the coffee percolated on the stove, and Lena sat across from Tom at a kitchen table scarred with 30 years of use. The walls were decorated with cattle brand certificates and county fair ribbons, the ordinary accumulation of an ordinary life. Nothing German, nothing military, nothing to suggest that the woman pouring coffee had once worn the uniform of America's enemy. Tom laid the photograph on the table between them. It was a military ID photo, standard issue for POWs, showing a young woman with short dark hair and eyes that stared straight into the camera without flinching. Lena Hoffman, prisoner number 34782, captured near Tunis in May 1943. Tom had pulled it from the archives, along with everything else the Army had on file. There wasn't much. The Germans had sent women to North Africa as support staff, clerks and nurses and radio operators. Lena had been a radio operator. When Rommel's Africa Corps collapsed, she'd been swept up with thousands of others, shipped across the Atlantic, ended up in Texas because Texas had space and cotton fields that needed picking. Lena picked up the photograph, studied it with the detachment of someone looking at a stranger. "I was 20 years old," she said. "I'd never been outside of Germany before the war. I thought Africa was romantic, like in the adventure books, palm trees and ancient ruins. It was dust and flies and dysentery. Then it was a ship's hold and barbed wire and cotton fields that stretched to the horizon. I didn't know cotton had to be picked by hand. In Germany, we had machines for everything." She set the photograph down, pushed it back toward Tom. "That girl died a long time ago, Sheriff. What's left is Lena Hansen." Tom didn't touch the photograph. "You escaped during a work detail. August 17th, 1943. 5 prisoners and 2 guards picking cotton on the Morrison farm. When the guards did the count at sundown, you were gone. They found your prison uniform in a creek bed 2 miles away. The army assumed you drowned or died of exposure. They stopped looking after 3 weeks. He paused, watching her face. Where did you go? Lena stood up, walked to the window, looked out at her land. The afternoon sun painted everything gold, the grass and the cattle and the distant hills. The Morrison farm bordered the Edwards Plateau, limestone country full of caves and springs. I grew up in the Bavarian Alps, Sheriff. I knew how to live in the mountains. I knew how to hide. She turned back to him, and her voice was steady. I walked north for 3 days, traveling at night, sleeping in caves during the day. I had a canteen I'd stolen from the camp, and I knew how to find water. On the 4th day, I found an abandoned line shack way up in the hills where nobody went. There was a roof and a stove and a creek nearby. I stayed there for 2 years. 2 years alone in the Texas hills. Tom tried to imagine it and couldn't. What did you eat? I trapped rabbits. I caught fish. There was a vegetable garden gone wild behind the shack, and I got it producing again. Tomatoes, squash, beans. In the winter, I nearly starved, but I made it through. I read every book in that shack a dozen times. There were old newspapers, and that's how I learned better English. I practiced talking to myself so I wouldn't forget how to speak. She smiled faintly. I went a little crazy, I think. But I survived. And in 1945, when the war ended and the prisoners were sent home, I knew I couldn't go back. There was nothing to go back to. My family was in Dresden. Do you know what happened to Dresden, Sheriff? Tom knew. Everyone knew. The firebombing in February 1945, the city turned to ash, tens of thousands dead. The Allies called it a military necessity. The Germans called it a Holocaust. History would argue about it forever, but for Lena Hoffman it was personal. I'm sorry, Tom said, and meant it. Lena nodded, accepting the condolence. I came down from the hills in the summer of 1945. The war was over, and I needed to become someone else. I'd taken everything from the line shack, everything I could carry. There was a strong box with $300 in it, probably some cowboy savings. I took it. I'm not proud of that, but I needed money to start over. I walked to a town I'd never been to, a place where nobody knew me. I said I was a war widow from Colorado, and I had papers to prove it. She saw Tom's expression and added, I stole those too. From a church in another town, from their donation box. Someone had given old documents, birth certificates, and marriage licenses from people who'd died. I found a woman about my age, born in Germany but raised in America, Lena Hansen. She died of influenza in 1944. I became her. Identity theft, fraud, theft. Tom mentally added up the charges, knowing he'd never file them. And nobody questioned it? It was 1945, Sheriff. Half of America was displaced persons, refugees, people starting over. As long as you were white and spoke English and didn't cause trouble, nobody looked too close. I bought land. I worked hard. I became American. Not the America I'd been taught to hate during the war, but the real America. The America that judges you by what you do, not where you're from. She sat back down at the table, met his eyes. I know I broke the law. I know I should have turned myself in, but I was 22 years old, and I was alone, and I wanted to live. That's not a justification, it's just the truth. Tom thought about the law, about duty, about the oath he'd sworn when he pinned on the badge. He thought about the Army's file, stamped closed 30 years ago, everyone involved long since transferred or retired. He thought about Lena Hansen, who paid her taxes and employed a dozen ranch hands and had never caused a moment of trouble. He thought about Lena Hoffman, who'd been a 20-year-old radio operator on the wrong side of a war she didn't start. What do you want me to do? He asked. I don't know, Lena said. I've been waiting for this day for 30 years. I always knew someone might figure it out. I'm not asking for mercy, Sheriff. I'm just asking you to understand. Tom stood up, picked up the photograph, slipped it back into the folder. I need to think about this. I need to talk to some people. But Lena, you need to understand something too. This isn't just going to go away. That lawyer in Austin, he's already asking questions. Other people are going to start digging. This is going to come out one way or another. He paused at the door. You might want to get yourself a lawyer. After Tom left, Lena sat alone in her kitchen as the sun went down and the shadows grew long. She'd known this day would come eventually. You couldn't run forever, couldn't hide forever, not really. The past always caught up. She thought about Germany, about the girl she'd been, about the war that had taken everything and everyone she'd loved. She thought about Texas, about the life she'd built, about the person she'd become. Were they the same person, Lena Hoffman and Lena Hansen? Or had one died in those hills and the other been born in her place? She didn't know. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe all that mattered was what happened next. The next morning, Maria Delgado arrived at the ranch at dawn like she had every morning for the past 15 years. Maria was 50 years old, tough as mesquite, the best horsebreaker in the county. She'd started as a hired hand and become Lena's foreman. Her friend, the closest thing to family either of them had. Maria took one look at Lena's face and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked. Lena told her everything. The war, the escape, the years in hiding, the false identity. She told her about Tom Brennan's visit, about the photograph, about the past coming back to claim her. When she finished, Maria was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You should have told me sooner. I couldn't risk it. The fewer people who knew, the safer I was." "Safer," Maria repeated. "You mean lonelier." She shook her head. 30 years, Lena. 30 years you carried this alone. That's too long." She stood up, dusted off her jeans. "Well, you're not alone now. Whatever happens, we face it together. You hear me?" Lena felt something break loose in her chest, some knot of fear and isolation she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. "Thank you," she said, and her voice cracked. "Don't thank me yet," Maria said. "We've got work to do. If this is coming out, we need to control the story. We need to get ahead of it. And we need to make sure people understand who you really are, not who you used to be." Maria was right, Lena realized. The story was going to break whether she wanted it to or not. Better to shape it herself than let others shape it for her. How do we do that? We talk to a reporter. Someone who'll listen, who'll tell the truth. Someone who's not just looking for a sensational headline. Maria thought for a moment. There's a young guy who works for the Austin paper, Bobby Chen. He did that series last year about the migrant workers. Really fair reporting. He's got a reputation for getting the human side of stories. Let me make some calls. Bobby Chen was 26 years old, hungry for a story that would make his career, and skeptical when he got the call about a German POW hiding in Texas for 30 years. It sounded like a hoax or a conspiracy theory or both. But Maria Delgado was persistent, and she had documents. And when Bobby drove out to the Hansen ranch and sat across from Lena in that kitchen, he knew within 5 minutes that it was real. This was the story. This was the one that would put his name on the map. But as Lena talked, as she told him about the war and the escape and the decades of hiding, Bobby realized something else. This wasn't just a story about a fugitive. This was a story about identity, about redemption, about what it meant to be American. This was a story that mattered. Bobby interviewed Lena for 3 days. He recorded everything, took hundreds of pages of notes, photographed the ranch and the hills and the old POW campsite. He talked to Tom Brennan, who confirmed the facts grudgingly, clearly conflicted about his role in bringing Lena's secret to light. He talked to neighbors, who were shocked but mostly supportive. He talked to historians who provided context about the German POWs in Texas, about the women who'd served in the Wehrmacht, about the chaos of the post-war years. And then he wrote the story of his life. The article ran on a Sunday, front page of the Austin American Statesman, with a photograph of Lena standing on her ranch looking out at the hills that had hidden her and then sheltered her. The headline read, "The German POW Who Became a Texas Rancher, A Story of Survival, Deception, and the American Dream." Bobby had written it carefully, balancing the facts with empathy, acknowledging the laws Lena had broken while highlighting the life she'd built. He'd included quotes from neighbors praising her character, from historians explaining the context, from Tom Brennan wrestling with the moral complexity of the situation. It was fair, it was thorough, and it was devastating. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The wire services picked up the story. By Monday, it was in newspapers across the country. By Tuesday, the television crews had arrived in town. Reporters camped out at the end of Lena's driveway, shouting questions whenever she left the house. The phone rang constantly. Letters arrived by the sackful, some supportive, some hateful, most confused. The Army issued a terse statement saying they were reviewing the case. The Justice Department said they were considering whether to file charges. Veterans groups demanded prosecution. Civil rights groups demanded clemency. Everyone had an opinion, and nobody knew what would happen next. Through it all, Lena stayed on her ranch, working her cattle, refusing most interview requests, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Maria ran interference, screening calls, turning away reporters, keeping the operation running. Tom Brennan found himself in the uncomfortable position of being both the man who'd exposed Lena and the man most sympathetic to her situation. He gave one interview to Bobby Chen in which he said, "I don't know what the right answer is here. I know what the law says. I know what my duty is. But I also know that Lena Hansen has been a model citizen for 30 years. She's contributed to this community, employed people, paid her taxes, harmed no one. At what point does the statute of limitations on the past expire? At what point do we judge people by who they are now, not who they were then? I don't have those answers. I wish I did." The legal questions were thorny. Lena had technically been a prisoner of war, and escaping from a POW camp was a violation of military law. But the war had ended 28 years ago, and most of the relevant statutes had expired. The identity fraud was more serious, but even there, the laws were murky. She'd stolen a dead woman's identity, but she'd never defrauded anyone, never collected benefits or insurance under false pretenses. She'd simply existed, quietly and productively, for 3 decades. The Justice Department lawyers huddled and debated, and eventually issued a statement saying they saw no compelling public interest in prosecution. The Army, relieved to avoid a public relations nightmare, agreed. The case was closed again, this time officially and permanently. But the court of public opinion was still in session. The story had touched something deep in the American psyche, a tension between law and justice, between punishment and forgiveness, between the past and the present. Letters to the editor poured in. Talk radio hosts debated endlessly. Some people saw Lena as a criminal who'd evaded justice for 30 years. Others saw her as a refugee who'd escaped tyranny and built a new life through hard work and determination. Still others saw her as a symbol of the moral ambiguity of war, of the fact that the enemy wore a human face, that soldiers were people with families and dreams and fears, just like everyone else. The debate raged for weeks, and through it all, Lena said nothing publicly. She'd told her story to Bobby Chen, and that was enough. She had no interest in becoming a celebrity or a cause. She just wanted to go back to her life, to her ranch, to the quiet anonymity she'd built so carefully over 3 decades. But anonymity was impossible now. The story had made her famous, whether she wanted it or not. People drove out to the ranch just to see where she lived, to catch a glimpse of the German POW who'd become a Texas rancher. Some were curious, some were hostile, most were just confused. Maria had to hire security to keep trespassers off the property. The local sheriff's department, embarrassed by the attention, posted a deputy at the end of the driveway. Tom Brennan, feeling responsible for the chaos he'd unleashed, came by almost daily to check on things. "I'm sorry," he told Lena one afternoon, standing on her porch with his hat in his hands. "I never thought it would turn into this circus." "You were doing your job," Lena said. "And honestly, Sheriff, part of me is relieved. I've been carrying this secret for 30 years. It's exhausting, always looking over your shoulder, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. At least now it's out in the open. At least now I don't have to hide anymore." Tom nodded, but he still looked troubled. "What are you going to do now?" "What I've always done," Lena said. "Run my ranch. Take care of my cattle. Live my life. The only difference is now people know the truth. And you know what? Most of them don't care. Oh, there are some who think I should be locked up, sure. But most people, they just see a 70-year-old woman who's worked hard and paid her dues. The war was a long time ago, Sheriff. Most folks are ready to let it stay in the past." She was right, Tom realized. The initial furor was already dying down. The television crews had moved on to other stories. The protesters had gone home. Life in the small Texas town was returning to normal, or as normal as it could be with a former German POW living in their midst. People still stared when Lena came into town, still whispered when she walked past, but they also nodded hello and held doors open and asked about her cattle. She was still Lena Hansen, their neighbor, even if they now knew she'd once been someone else. The one person who couldn't let it go was Colonel William Hayes, or rather, his son. William Hayes Jr. had been 10 years old when his father commanded the POW camp, and he'd grown up hearing stories about the war, about duty and honor and the importance of following orders. When he read Bobby Chen's article, he was furious. His father had died believing that prisoner had drowned, had carried that failure to his grave, and now it turned out she'd been alive all along, living free while his father tortured himself over losing a prisoner on his watch. It wasn't right. It wasn't justice. William Hayes Jr., now a lawyer in Dallas, decided to do something about it. He filed a civil lawsuit against Lena, claiming that her escape and subsequent identity fraud had caused his father emotional distress and damaged his military career. It was a long shot legally, and most lawyers told him so, but Hayes was determined. He wanted his day in court. He wanted Lena to be held accountable, if not criminally, then at least financially. The lawsuit made headlines, reigniting the debate about Lena's past. The trial was set for the following spring, and suddenly everyone had an opinion again about what should happen to the German POW who'd hidden in Texas for 30 years. Lena hired a lawyer, a sharp young woman from Austin named Rebecca Stern, whose grandparents had fled Nazi Germany in 1938. Rebecca saw the case as a chance to make a statement about redemption and second chances, about the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice. She threw herself into Lena's defense with a passion that surprised even Lena herself. "This isn't just about you," Rebecca told her during one of their strategy sessions. "This is about every refugee, every immigrant, every person who's ever had to reinvent themselves to survive. We're going to win this case, Lena, and we're going to make sure your story becomes a symbol of hope, not shame." The trial began on a warm April morning in 1974. The courthouse was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and people on both sides of the debate. William Hayes Jr. sat in the front row with his lawyers, grim-faced and determined. Lena sat at the defense table with Rebecca, calm and composed, her hands folded in her lap. She dressed simply, in a plain dress and sensible shoes, looking every bit the hard-working rancher she was. When the judge called the court to order, the room fell silent. Hayes's lawyers presented their case first. They painted a picture of Colonel William Hayes as a dedicated officer, who'd taken his responsibilities seriously, who'd been devastated by the loss of a prisoner on his watch. They introduced letters and diary entries showing his anguish, his self-recrimination, his belief that he'd failed in his duty. They argued that Lena's escape had caused him years of unnecessary suffering, and that she should be held financially responsible for that harm. It was an emotional argument, and by the time they finished, several people in the courtroom were wiping their eyes. Then it was Rebecca's turn. She stood up, walked to the center of the courtroom, and looked at the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "this case is not about Colonel Hayes. I don't mean to diminish his suffering, but the truth is he was a soldier doing his job in wartime. Prisoners escape. It happens. It's unfortunate, but it's not a tragedy. The real tragedy is what happened to Lena Hoffman." She turned to Lena, gestured for her to stand. This woman was 20 years old when the war ended. 20 years old, and everyone she'd ever loved was dead. Her parents, her siblings, her friends, all killed in the firebombing of Dresden. She had nothing to go back to, no home, no family, no future. She was alone in a foreign country, facing deportation to a Germany that no longer existed. So she did what any of us would do in her situation. She survived. She adapted. She built a new life. Rebecca walked back to the defense table, picked up a stack of documents. "Over the next few days, we're going to show you exactly what kind of life Lena Hansen built. We're going to introduce testimony from her employees, her neighbors, her friends. We're going to show you tax records proving she's paid every cent she's owed to this country. We're going to show you charitable donations, community service, a lifetime of good citizenship. And then we're going to ask you a simple question. Does this woman, who has contributed so much to her community and her country, deserve to be punished for choices she made as a desperate 20-year-old refugee? I think you'll agree the answer is no." The trial lasted 2 weeks. Rebecca called witness after witness, each one testifying to Lena's character, her work ethic, her contributions to the community. Maria Delgado took the stand and talked about Lena's loyalty and generosity, how she'd given Maria a chance when nobody else would, how she'd built a ranch that employed dozens of people and supported local businesses. Tom Brennan testified about his own conflicted feelings, his belief that justice wasn't always black and white. Even some of Lena's former employees from the POW camp testified, old men now, saying she'd been a good worker, never caused trouble, just wanted to get through the war and go home. Hayes's lawyers tried to counter with their own witnesses, but their case was weak. They couldn't prove that Lena's escape had directly caused Colonel Hayes's emotional distress, couldn't show that his career had suffered because of it. The more they pushed, the more sympathetic Lena became. By the end of the trial, even the judge seemed to be on her side. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. "We find in favor of the defendant, Lena Hansen." The courtroom erupted in applause. William Hayes Jr. sat frozen in his seat, his face pale with shock and anger. Lena closed her eyes, let out a breath she'd been holding for weeks. Rebecca squeezed her hand. "It's over," she whispered. "You're free." But it wasn't quite over. As Lena and Rebecca left the courthouse, they were mobbed by reporters shouting questions. Lena had avoided the press throughout the trial, but now, standing on the courthouse steps with the verdict behind her, she decided it was time to speak. She raised her hand and the crowd quieted. "I want to say something," she began, her voice steady despite the cameras and microphones thrust in her face. "I want to thank the jury for their verdict, and I want to thank everyone who supported me through this ordeal. But I also want to acknowledge that what I did was wrong. I broke the law. I stole someone's identity. I lived a lie for 30 years. Those are facts, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She paused, gathered her thoughts. "But I also want people to understand why I did it. I was a refugee, alone and afraid, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. I made choices that allowed me to survive, to build a life, to become the person I am today. Were they the right choices? I don't know, but they were the only choices I had at the time. And I hope, that most people can understand that." A reporter shouted a question. "Do you regret what you did?" Lena considered this. "I regret the pain I caused to people like Colonel Hayes, who took their duties seriously and suffered when I escaped. I regret the deception, the lies I had to tell to maintain my new identity. But do I regret surviving? Do I regret building a life here in Texas, contributing to my community, becoming an American? No, I don't regret that, and I won't apologize for it." Another reporter. "What will you do now?" Lena smiled faintly. "What I've always done. Go back to my ranch, take care of my cattle, live my life. I'm 70 years old. I don't have time for drama or controversy. I just want to spend whatever years I have left in peace, doing the work I love, with the people I care about." And that's exactly what she did. Lena returned to her ranch, and slowly, gradually, the attention faded. The reporters moved on to other stories. The protesters found other causes. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be for a woman who'd lived 2 lives. She continued to run her ranch with Maria's help, continued to be a fixture in the community, continued to be Lena Hansen. The past was no longer a secret, but it was still the past. What mattered was the present and the future. Tom Brennan visited her one last time a few months after the trial. They sat on her porch drinking iced tea and watching the sunset paint the hills gold and orange. "I've been thinking," Tom said, "about what you said on the courthouse steps, about making the only choices you had at the time. I think that's true for all of us, isn't it? We do the best we can with what we have, and we hope it's enough. That's all any of us can do." Lena agreed. "I'm retiring next month," Tom said. 40 years in law enforcement, and I still don't have all the answers. But I've learned one thing. The law is important, but it's not everything. Sometimes justice means following the rules, and sometimes it means knowing when to bend them. You taught me that, Lena. I didn't mean to teach you anything, Sheriff. I was just trying to survive. I know, but that's the lesson, isn't it? Survival, adaptation, becoming something new while still honoring what you were. That's not just your story, Lena. That's America's story. That's all of our stories. Lena smiled. When did you become a philosopher, Sheriff? Tom laughed. About the same time you became a symbol. We're both too old for this, you know. I know. But here we are anyway. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared behind the hills and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Two old people, shaped by war and time and choices both good and bad, finding peace in the twilight of their lives. It wasn't the ending either of them had expected, but it was the ending they'd earned. And sometimes that was enough. Lena Hansen lived for another 12 years, dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 82. She left her ranch to Maria Delgado, who continued to run it according to Lena's principles: hard work, fair dealing, and respect for the land. The story of the German POW who became a Texas rancher faded into local legend, told and retold until fact and fiction blurred together. But the truth remained, preserved in court records and newspaper archives and the memories of those who'd known her. Lena Hoffman had become Lena Hansen, and in doing so she'd become something more, a testament to the human capacity for reinvention, for redemption, for hope in the face of impossible odds. She'd survived a war, escaped captivity, built a life from nothing, and in the end she'd won not just her freedom but her right to be judged not by her past, but by the person she'd chosen to become. That was her legacy, and it endured long after she was gone. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Lena's incredible journey. What would you have done in her situation? Let us know below.